using our inspiration piece as a model, we're going to do our leaves. To understand how we're going to do the leaves that stick off the edge of our wall piece, I think first we want to understand how we're going to do the leaves that don't stick off of the wall piece. So I've done a drawing here that I previewed last time that shows the basic shape, and I've just copied the shape above basically with the pencil outline, and then I've drawn the veining, and then I'm doing sort of a back and forth stitching to do the outline of the leaf, and I finally will fill that in a little bit with some just basic stippling. So when I did this last time, I overlapped my petals onto my leaves, and now I've marked my leaf in chalk, and we want to make sure that in every case we stay at least the width of our binding, which mine's going to be 1/2 inch or 3/8 of an inch. We want to stay that far away from the edge, unless this is one of the ones that's going to stick off, and then we'll get a special treatment. But so I have 4 leaves total that don't stick off the edge and 3 that will. And in this case, there's so little here that I'm just going to trim this off. And you can trim it off at 1/8, or you can trim it even shorter, but it's not going to show much at all, and I'm not concerned about it. You'll see here that I've painted since last time, and I just used my halo blue green and metallic russet to paint that, and it kind of mirrors this line, which was intentional. And then there are a few areas where in some of these spots I painted with a little bit of russet, but there aren't very many of those, and you might notice those as we're working. But so I've chalked my outline, and whenever chalk works and I can see it enough to follow it, I'm going to use chalk because it comes out really well. One of the things I wanted to say about some of the marking pens that exist, there are some that when you get them wet to wash them out, they keep coming back on you. And then there are others that if you hit them with a hot iron, say you're heat setting this, and you hit a marking pen with a hot iron, some of them will become permanent. And in fact, on my inspiration piece where I drew in my veining with pen, that kind you have to heat set with an iron to make it permanent. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to go around and stitch the veining on 4 of the leaves, the ones that don't stick off the edge. This seems like a good time to make the point that if you've bitten off a little bit more than you feel like chewing right now, you could redesign your quilt so that your leaves just end at the edge of the quilt, the same way that they would end at the hem of a dress if you had leaves all over a print on your dress. Because remember that our skill set increases sometimes slowly and sometimes in spurts of proficiency, and I think it's a good idea not to struggle. You know, if you're challenged and you're engaged and you're enjoying it, that's a great sign that you should continue. But if you actually want to abandon your piece because it's just more than you were bargaining for, why not scale back a little? Here I'm going to cut some batting into little strips. You can use anything in here, yarn, pillow stuffing would work, little scraps of fabric would be fine, but this is what I have, so I'm just cutting this up to use. I'm just going to use a wooden chopstick to push into the little areas between the veins, and I like wood because it catches on the batting and pushes it in easily. Metal can slip too much. And you don't want to overstuff these because we're not going to stitch over the batting, we're going to stitch up to it, and I wouldn't do them all exactly the same. Have some a little fuller and some a little less. And if you overstuff, your piece is going to buckle too much, and so you want to be careful of that, and you want to be careful that you don't have the ends of your strips of yarn or whatever you're using sticking way out so that you can't stitch in those areas. If we have an area where it's a little puckery along the edge, what we can do when we go to bind is stitch along there and then sort of gather that up, really just cinch it flat and then bind it. And then that way the piece will appear a lot flatter than if we just allowed the edge to be buckled. But we can tighten that up a little bit. And I do think that this flower is really a trapunto element, even out here on the petals where there's a second layer of batting, and then especially in the center where we've got a few different layers stacked up. So I'm just going to put a little stuffing in all of these, and as I go back around to stitch them, if anything seems like it's too full or should have more added, I can do that at the last minute. But to prepare for stitching, I'll just put some in each one of the little pockets. So now I'm ready to stitch this with a lighter thread, and I'm going to start out by going around the outside edge. I've noticed that this chalk actually shows up better on camera than it does to me, which is great. I'm going to stitch around the outside, kind of doing a triple line where you just go forward a little bit, come back, and then sort of seesaw back and forth until you get around the outside edge of the leaf. And after that, whatever side that I'm on, I will come back and stipple a little bit around the inside. And when I do that stippling, I'll let how much batting is in each little pocket determine how far I go in. I'll just get to the point where my darning foot bumps up against the edge of the batting, and then I'll stop. I won't try to drive up on the batting, even though my machine would easily do that and sew through the batting. I'll just sew up to it, and then I'll move back out and make my way around the leaf that way. And then of course I trim in the usual manner, and I leave very little on this edge where I'm just cleaning it off underneath the petal, but everywhere else I leave about 1/8 of an inch. You don't want to go less than 1/16, and you don't really want to go over 3/16. I think it's important to remember that for me, these techniques are rooted in collage, which was an early love of mine. And so overlapping is assumed, but we need to push that envelope as much as we can without causing trouble. And so if it's causing your machine trouble, of course you need to back off and reduce the number of layers that you're sewing through. And the order of construction can be altered to relieve some of the trouble. Sometimes you can grade or in other ways trim away some of the thickness before you sew through an area. But at any time that you wanted to veer off and make your piece something completely different, I think you should do so if that's what your heart is telling you to do. But in the meantime, I'm going to introduce an idea that, for lack of a better term, I'm going to call split construction. Split construction is when you can't just make your piece in a linear fashion where you just do A, then B, then C, then D. Split construction is a way to describe situations where you do part of something and then you do another process, such as washing and binding. I also use the term to describe situations like with our leaves, where we can't just do A, B, C. We have to do part of A and B and C, and then come back and fill in whatever needs to happen for it to look seamless and like it was pretty much all done at one time. When you wash your quilt, throw in a piece of batting that is about the size of half a sheet of paper, and also include the same amount of either your backing fabric or your leaf fabric, so that you have something to put on the back of your leaf. And after you've washed, go ahead and dry it on high. You want everything to shrink as much as possible the first time. And then press it from behind with a lot of steam. I recommend at this point you take a minute and trim off all the fray, because once you've done that, your work starts to emerge. It really doesn't look its best when it has all that extra ratty stuff. You'll probably have to trim off around the edges as well, which just takes a second. And then you're going to want to re-steam it, but this time, instead of working on it, I want you to pat it flat on a surface like a table or countertop and let it dry overnight, which is essentially like blocking. And it's a good idea to leave it flat like that until you bind it. Don't fold it up and then come back and bind it. Okay, so I've taken a minute to make a little mock-up of 4 different types of binding. And This is just my little sample piece that I tested my stitching on. And so this sample here is a double binding, and I stitched in the ditch for a short distance, but the rest it's actually taped down right now, but it would be hand sewn. And so this is one possibility. And what I wanted to talk about with this one is that this binding is going to add 1, 2, 3, 4, and then when this goes over the top, 5, 6 layers of fabric. And depending on how you do your leaves that stick off the edge, you might be tempted to just stitch through this, and I don't want you to do that unless you are positive your machine can do it. This one is a mock-up of a single binding, which I would hand sew generally, where you make a piece of bias tape essentially and put it on, and it adds on the front two layers of fabric on the front, and then 2 more on the back. And so this adds 4 layers to your piece. The next one is a binding that's very much like the potholder binding, where you sew on your fabric, you know, like this, and it folds around to the front, and then you do your decorative stitching and cut it out. And this type of binding adds 1, 2, 3 layers of fabric to your edge. The last type that I want to show you is essentially a 2-sided raw edge binding, where you take one piece of fabric, you know, you iron a fold down the center and you put it on your piece, and then you quilt that, and then you trim it on the front and you trim it on the back, and this adds 2 layers. Well, any of these bindings will work for you. It's important to choose one that complements your piece and also will be easy to deal with. I'm going to show you how to do the leaf without stitching through any of it, but it's going to be tempting, because if your leaf isn't positioned exactly perfectly, you're going to want to stitch onto your binding and maybe even back off of it. And that's something you need to do very carefully, if at all. I suggest you avoid it. 6 layers is a lot to add. 4 is better. 3 is pretty reasonable. 2 is the least that I know of to do it, other than just, you know, zigzagging your edge or something. After a lot of deliberation, I decide to do a double binding, and I like to do mine by stitching some fusible thread on, and I like to do it a little closer to the edge than my binding's going to be, and this allows things to be simplified when it gets to hand sewing. So after adding my fusible thread, I cut 3 pieces of binding from selvage to selvage, and I prepare them in the usual way. I have tutorials on how to do this type of binding, as well as another shorter one on how to adjust your plan to do the wavy sides, but you can find those links underneath the video. And once I've joined them, I press it down the whole length to make my double binding. When that's done, I like to place the binding on the wall hanging, planning how the corners will be sewn and making sure that none of my diagonals will fall right in the corner area. And if needed, I actually take the time to move one of my diagonal seams if it keeps me out of those areas. Then I attach the binding the way that I always do. I stitch around with regular thread at 1/2 inch with the binding on top of the quilt, doing the corners in the usual way, and then I take and press the front open, and then I press the back so that my binding is stuck to that fusible for the time that it takes me to do my hand sewing. So I wanted to show you on paper how I'm going to do these leaves that stick off, and so I'm just going to attempt to show you. I'm going to make this, say that's my leaf and say my binding comes through like this, and I'm gonna put some layers underneath this point, and I'll show you that in a minute, and the batting part of it will come somewhere like that. And then say the leaf I want to do is like this, and then once we have so I'll flip the quilt back so I'm just stitching on the point of the leaf, and then I'm going to do first my outline stitch, and I'm going to stop on the batting pretty much, and then I'll come back and I'll do a little stipple. I can stop with a circle, and you can do this any various different ways. Whatever works for you is great. So then I'm going to flip this all back down onto my quilt, and the first thing I'm going to do is do some veining. We're going to go and we're going to put some stuffing. So I've stuffed that out, and then I'm going to come back after I've done that, and I am going to just pick something to do first. I can either stipple first, or I can do my stitches first, and I can start on this end or this end, whatever works for me. So I'm just going to start up here, and I'm going to finish shaping my leaf, and then I'll come back and stipple, and that's one side. And then same thing over here. I'll just pick a place to start so that I have a finished leaf. And you'll notice that all the A stitching is on the tip of the leaf and goes through the batting and other layers, and all of the B stitching is through one layer of leaf fabric and the quilt itself. And in this way I finish my leaf. This looks harder than it is. It's actually pretty easy to do, and you could assemble your leaves and stitch the tips before you sew your quilt together with your flowers on top of them. But I've always put the leaves in under the flowers and then figured out what the leaves were shaped like later. We've got my plan, and I don't know that I'll do all these veins, but I've got a lot of veining here, and then the outside of my leaf is shaped like this. And for this plan I have a piece of batting that sticks pretty far in, and then I have a piece of thick interfacing that doesn't go quite as far, and it can vary. I mean, you can do this lots of different ways and try to do it with materials you have around. And then my backing, and if you don't like the way a bit of this color shows through on your backing, you can use your leaf fabric. So I get all this positioned, so that it's sort of hiding behind my plan for my leaf. I really want to just sort of stitch right on the edge of this, and some on and some off, but I don't want to have, when I trim it, to have a bunch of batting and interfacing showing. Okay, so there's a little, you just have to fuss around with this a little bit. Then this would all shift around on me horribly while I was working, and so what I'm going to do is put a little bit of Stitch Witchery between the layers, just a little bit. Not really exactly in the same spot, because then you're adding thickness again. But I'm just going to make it so it's all fusible. Okay, and then my light is better here on the sewing table, so I did this here, but really I normally do this at my iron, and then I can immediately iron it. And so that's what I'm going to go do. So here is my piece all ironed together. My disappearing ink is gone, and so I remark with chalk. I darkly mark the line that my stitching needs to cross. I also take a minute to indicate the other elements, because it's very easy to forget what you're doing and make a Frankenstein leaf. I find that usually you can fold back the bound edge and use the weight of the rest of the quilt to hold everything flat so that it's out of your way and you can work on the leaf. You could secure your quilt with clips if that helps you. Don't be tempted to grab this tip with your fingers. Use tweezers. Mine have a little tooth like a forceps and are easy to pull the leaf around. Here I've already trimmed back my leaf tip so that I can start to get a sense of how it's shaped. I could try and do a clever way of stitching a partial vein here and then add to it later. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to take a little bit of batting and I'm going to poke it down into the area down there. And I'm not going to have my vein go onto the binding. I'm going to have it come up to it. And I'm going to kind of justify that by having this have some stuffing right there. And ultimately, I'm going to take and I'm going to hand sew this on the back. Now I'm not planning to actually stitch onto my binding at all. And in fact, having that batting there is gonna remind me not to try to stitch onto there, because I really can't get all the way to it. So I'm gonna do some veining. It may turn out just like I drew it before, it may not. But I'll try to get you a good view of it, whatever I do. It's a bit tortured looking, but I'm so ready to have this done that I don't care. I'm just going to finish it. So now I'm going to switch threads again. Sorry you can't see what I'm doing here better, but I'm just cutting out parts of the batting that are loose and easy to get to. And I am going to cut out a bunch of this extra stuff. Alright, so now I want to finish out and I want to do a little bit of stuffing in there. So I'm going to play with this some more. And let's turn back on the machine. I'm just going to hop over to here. And I get a little closer. Now I'm going to trim this out. Vein's a little tortured. And I want to brush this some more. And of course it brushes the neighboring areas, which is fine. Alright, so, and this will get, the final trimming, it'll get cleaned up even a little more. And so, see, this is where if you don't like the way this backing fabric looks, and here I've got a tiny bit of batting showing, that doesn't bother me. If it bothers you, you might need to find another way to do this. And then the last part to this is just a little bit of hand sewing. And so to do it, I'm going to hide my big fat knot under there. And so all I'm going to do is stitch this so that it's really sewn down at the edge. I like this piece, it's nearly done. Next time I'm going to do some additional embellishing. I might do a little bit of satin stitching on the leaves, and I might paint my veins, and I could do some other things like that. I don't know if we'll get to the very mundane matters of putting on a hanging sleeve and making the stick that goes through it. And I may just mostly reference you to videos that I've done already. And I'm going to do my holes next time. And those will have to be done so that they're not where the hanging sleeve is, but anywhere else is fair game. And so this is it. Though it's really starting to look like what it's going to look like. Although we're going to gild the lily a little bit more next time. When in fact, you've split things up. You could also call it clever construction. Or tortured construction. Or crazy construction.